Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here today. Welcome to all of those who are watching online through our live stream. My name is Stephen White. I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Project here at the Catholic University of America. The Catholic Project, for those of you who are not familiar, was founded in the wake of the acute abuse crisis of 2018 and 2019 as a way to promote faithful collaboration and shared responsibility between laity and clergy in addressing the great challenges facing our church. You can find more about the work of the Catholic Project, as well as find the text of the report that we're going to be speaking about today at our website, catholicproject.catholic.edu. I'm joined here today by Dr. Brandon Vaidyanathan, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Sociology here at Catholic University. Brandon served as the lead researcher on this study, which I will happily note is the largest study of American Catholic priests in more than 50 years. I'd also like to mention and thank a few people who have made this study possible. Dr. Christopher Jacoby, who's here with his wife, welcome. Dr. Chelsea Kelly and Dr. Tricia Bruce and her team who took the lead on the qualitative portion of our study. My colleague at the Catholic Project, Sarah Perla, who's in the back working furiously, has been invaluable throughout the process, so thank you to all of you. The idea for this study first came about several years ago when an American bishop mentioned to John Garvey, who was at the time the president of Catholic University, that it seemed to him, to this bishop, that the relationship between priests and bishops had changed somewhat over the years. What had once been akin to a father-son or brother-brother relationship had become somewhat depersonalized, had become, for lack of a better word, HR-ified. And that it might be worthwhile for someone to study how the abuse crisis and the church's response to that crisis had affected the relationship between priests and their bishops. This study set out to study precisely that. Our study has three primary components. The first was a census of bishops. That portion of the study was conducted on our behalf by the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, CARA, at Georgetown. The second portion of the study, for that portion, we paired up with Gallup to survey 10,000 priests across the United States. These inquiries received 3,615 responses, and that part of the survey represents the core of the data that we'll be presenting today. Third, we conducted more than 100 qualitative interviews with priests across the country. You will hear some of what they had to say in the presentation today. The bulk of that data is still being coded and processed, and I'm confident that it will continue to provide real insights into the American presbyterate for some time to come. I'm about to hand it over to Brandon. He'll present some slides with the sort of the headlines of our findings. After that, we'll turn it over for questions and hopefully good answers. All right, so without further ado, Brandon Vaidyanathan.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. Thanks to those of you who are watching. Also, special thanks to Dr. Christopher Jacoby for the great statistical analysis that's gone into this work, and Dr. Tricia Bruce for the qualitative work that we're going to share with you. So just to give you, again, a quick overview of what we're going to talk to you about, we did, first of all, this nationally representative survey of diocesan and religious priests in the country. Contacted 10,000 priests and got a 36% response rate for valid cases. The survey was conducted between February and June of 2022. This is, as Steve mentioned, the largest survey of the priesthood in 50 years. We also then conducted more than 100 in-depth qualitative interviews, in-depth conversations with a sample of those priests who were part of our survey sample. And then finally, we conducted a census of the U.S. bishops, for which we got a 67% response. And we asked bishops some of the same questions that we asked the priests, so we could compare their responses, and you'll see what those look like in just a little bit. So our key findings, if you fall asleep in about 5 minutes, you can stay awake for now and just take away these 3 points. On well-being, we found that priests and bishops report very high levels of well-being. I'll tell you what that means and how we measured it in a little bit, but we also found diocesan priests report significantly lower rates of well-being than religious, and younger priests reporting higher rates of burnout than older priests. Right? So there are some differences there that are important. The second point on trust, we found that diocesan priests have relatively low trust in bishops. And priests overall don't feel adequately supported by their bishops. So the concerns that Steve was mentioning that this bishop had raised to our former President Garvey are borne out in our statistical findings. And finally, regarding the policy, the questions as to whether priests support the policies that the church introduced in order to respond to the sexual abuse problem, those policies are largely supported by priests, even though there are anecdotes and stories and magazine articles from some priests that this is a cause for consternation among priests. We do find overwhelming support for those policies, but there are concerns that priests have about the need for due process and more clarity in how those policies are being implemented and rolled out. So, first point on well-being. What does it mean to measure well-being among priests and bishops? We used for this a measure of human flourishing developed by a group called the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. And they have a comprehensive assessment of well-being. It's a statistical measure that has 5 dimensions: happiness and life satisfaction, mental and physical health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. These are 10 questions. Each of them are measured on a scale of 1 to 10, and each of those 5 items has 2 questions. And so you get, at the end of the day, a 100-point scale. And on this 100-point scale, we see that priests and bishops are both flourishing. 82, a grade of 82 for priests and 83 for bishops out of 100. So getting 100 is really impossible, because one of the questions, for instance, is like, I am completely satisfied with my social relationships, which if you score 10 on that, it suggests you're more complacent than actually thriving in those relationships, right? So, but getting something like, between 80 to 90 is really very high. The general population doesn't score this high, and so the Harvard team told us that these are some of the highest scores of flourishing that they've seen, and this corroborates the research of others like Monsignor Steve Rossetti, who've also found high levels of flourishing among priests. Using a cutoff classification on this, if you want to say, well, what percentage of priests are flourishing, 77% of priests can be classified as flourishing, 81% of bishops on this scale. So pretty high levels of well-being overall. I'll give you a sense of what that looks like, right? We asked priests about how they're doing and where they find joy and to what extent they consider themselves thriving or flourishing. We hear things like this from one diocesan priest: I feel remarkably fulfilled in my life as a priest. I mean, just being able to minister to people, being able to love them, being able to be Christ for them is just such a beautiful life. And we asked them actually questions, all of our interviewed priests, we asked them, where do you find beauty in your work? I mean, all of them find beauty in their ministry. Some find beauty in the confessional. Some find beauty in the transformations they see in pastoral counseling. Others find beauty in the liturgy, but there's always avenues in their ministry where they find beauty in their work. A religious priest told us, I'm happy in my life. I find true joy. I love what I do. I love the people. I feel like I'm firing on all cylinders. I every day remind myself how I'm incapable on my own power to do this. I say, God, this is your church. You take care of it. Where you need me, give me what I need. I have a great healthy community here, friends outside the community, a structure of healthy self-care, regular prayer routine. These are all, in fact, the factors, if you look statistically, the factors that contribute to well-being. Feeling of a sense of support by my staff or my brothers, by the parish, by the parishioners, that I'm part of something positive and new and transformative that I feel is going on in the Archdiocese. There's creativity, there's growth, there's opportunity. What I do is meaningful and impactful. On that flourishing measure, one of those strongest indicators is a sense of meaning and purpose, and that is the highest category that priest scores. A very high sense of meaning and purpose is what contributes to their high levels of flourishing. But priest well-being is affected by their degree of trust in their bishop. And so on this graph, what you're seeing is essentially on the y-axis their score on the flourishing index from 0 to 100, and on the x-axis you're seeing that the responses to the question of how much confidence they have in their diocesan bishop. And so those priests who have a great deal of trust, the highest levels of trust in their bishop, have an 87 score on this index, and those with the lowest have 77. So 10 points is quite a bit on this flourishing index. And so you can see, and this, if you break it down by the different factors, it even affects physical health, not just mental health. So it even matters for priests' physical health, right? The degree of trust they have in your bishop. The second item we want to look at for well-being is burnout. And we measure burnout in ministry using an item we replicated, 3 items we replicated from a study called the Flourishing in Ministry Survey, conducted at the University of Notre Dame by Matt Bloom. And so there are 3 items. The first one is, it happens more and more often that I talk about my ministry in a negative way. The second was, during my ministry work, I often feel emotionally drained. The third one, I feel worn out and weary after my ministry work. So 3 components of burnout in their priestly ministry. A couple of things we find here. Younger priests and diocesan priests are more likely to report burnout. So you can see among diocesan priests, those who are the youngest group are the least frequency in reporting that they have no burnout at all. You can see the priests who are 75 and older are more likely to say they have no burnout at all. And the other figures correspondingly change. Among religious priests, you see the rates of no burnout are higher, right, than the diocesan priests. And again, the age difference is visible there too, right? So across both diocesan and religious priests, the younger priests are the ones who are more likely to report burnout. And what does that look like? What are the kinds of responses? When we ask priests in their interviews around burnout, about whether they experience burnout, here are the kinds of things we hear. From one diocesan priest who told us, not only is the diocese just looking at me to fill a hole in parish, just to be a cog in a machine, but there's also the sense of I'm expendable on the level of PR. Like if it's convenient, they'll totally throw me under the bus. A religious priest told us, I think a huge part of this crisis is, this overwhelming sense of need and busyness, which then not only makes it a challenge to pray and to get exercise, it also prevents us from being creative. So the sense of really being saddled with a lot more responsibility today than priests used to be, say 30, 40 years ago, where maybe you're a young priest just ordained and you're starting out with having to take care of 3 or 4 parishes and deal with the parish school that's closing down. And so there's the overwork part of it, and then the difficulty in feeling supported, adequately supported by your diocese in being able to take care of those responsibilities. We also find, when it comes to the organizational cultures in dioceses and religious orders, that there's a difference, that religious priests report more supportive organizational cultures than diocesan priests do. You see on the first item, we asked whether priests criticize other priests. Do they criticize policies or practices in your diocese or religious community? Right? So among diocesan priests, we find that 68% of them say, yeah, we're all criticizing policies in our diocese, whereas among religious, only 34% have that sense of cynicism or criticism. There's a little bit more support that religious priests find in their community compared to diocesan priests. Also, we can see this point that priests feel that they'll be seen as a liability if they approach their bishop with their personal struggles. 40% of priests feel that they'll be seen as a liability if they go to their bishop with personal struggles. 18% of religious priests feel that they'll be seen as a liability by their major superior, by contrast. And again, when it comes to stress, do priests feel stressed out when you talk about your bishop or major superior? Again, there's a big difference, right? Between diocesan priests are much more likely to feel stressed out just talking about their bishop than religious are. So I want to move on then to talking about trust, because this seems to be underlying some of these statistics on well-being. How much do priests trust their bishops or major superiors? We find that diocesan priests, compared to religious priests, report relatively low levels of trust in their bishops. So 67% of religious priests say that they're confident in the leadership and decision-making of their major superior, whereas 49% of diocesan priests say that they're confident in their bishop. If you look at U.S. bishops overall, only 24% of priests, and there's no difference between diocesan religions, only 24% of priests say they're confident in the U.S. bishops overall. And on this middle item here, priests in smaller dioceses we see are much more likely to express confidence in their bishops than priests in larger dioceses. This 49%, actually, if you look at what the variation is across dioceses, it's pretty massive. There are dioceses where there's a lot of trust in their bishop, there's dioceses where there's zero trust in their bishop, and everything in between. And we tried to look into, well, what are some of the things that predict this variation? One big factor is a sense of integrity. So does the bishop say something and do something else? That's a huge predictor of their sense of confidence in their bishop, those who think that their bishop is inconsistent that way. Another big predictor, in fact, 2 big predictors, are the degree of alignment, theologically and politically, between the priest and their bishop. So if you're a priest who is very conservative in a diocese where a bishop is politically or theologically progressive, you tend to report lower levels of trust and vice versa. Right? So those are some of the top contributors to that variation. On this other item, confidence in U.S. bishops, it is uniformly low. And we'll see in a minute why that might be the case. The confidence in bishops has changed over time. So we've replicated these questions to some degree from previous studies. And so if you look at the confidence in diocesan bishop, in in a national study that was done in '93 and another one that was done in 2001, you see that the levels of trust were higher than they are today. So there's some change over time, and the reasons for the change in trust are also a bit different today, right? We're talking about 2001 was before the revelations of sexual abuse and so on became prominent. Certainly before the McCarrick issue came to light, and those are the themes that come up in the interviews. Confidence in U.S. bishops overall, even in the past, it's been somewhat low. So that's not just a result of the crisis. You can see even in 1993, the levels of trust were quite low. And if you ask people about politicians, right? So how much do you trust your own, representative compared to, your state representative or whatever? There's also a similar discrepancy that people are more likely to trust their local politician than they are to trust, say, all of the senators and so forth. So there's some of that going on here as well. But there are also some reasons to be concerned. This figure, by the way, I have to note just to make sure we are accurate about this. In the 90s and early 2000s, the question here that was asked about the U.S. bishops was asked about the National Conference of U.S. Bishops. How much trust do you have? How much confidence do you have in the National Conference of Catholic Bishops? That was assimilated into the USCCB in 2001. We were advised not to ask about the USCCB when fielding this survey because no one knows really what that means. Are you talking about the people working in that office? Are you talking about the bishops, etc.? So there's a slight change in wording, and that could be in part responsible for some of this lower trust. But we have other advisors telling us that even in the past, when asked about the NCCB, a priest answering this would have been thinking about the bishops in general and not some office, right? So just keep that in mind. But here's some of the things we're hearing as to why this trust might have declined. One diocesan priest told us, instead of the bishop really being a father, he has just become like a slave driver and just an administrator, just wants to cover his own rear end and not really care about the priests. There's an idea that there's been a kind of change in that relationship. I think most priests, one diocesan priest told us, don't trust the bishops. I do think that in general terms, priests don't trust bishops. They can seem imperious, operating from hubris, think they're above the law. I think there's some validity to those assertions. And this has to do with the references constantly to the way in which the Dallas Charter did not apply to the bishops, and they were exempt from the policies and protocols that priests were subject to, and that sense of resentment for that comes up. There is, by the way, in all fairness, we did ask a question as to whether bishops should have been subjected to the same restrictions that priests were subject to in the Dallas Charter, and 93% of both bishops and priests agree, yes, we should have done this in the first place. So it's not like the bishops really, think they should have been exempt from that. Another diocesan priest told us, I don't really trust most of the bishops, to be honest with you. I'll show them a great amount of respect. If I was in their diocese, I would serve them and try, but just looking across the United States, looking at a lot of bishops, I would say I have an overall negative opinion of the bishops in the United States. I feel there's a lot of bishops that are just so beige, like just kind of milquetoast. They're not really leaders. They're just kind of chameleons looking up to climb up the ladder. So this critique of clericalism, which even Pope Francis has made, is pervasive among our priests. It's as though when the bishops come together, the whole is not greater than the sum of the parts, that something goes awry there. And that's the narrative that we hear over and over. And what's driving that, we're not entirely sure, but some of it, we think, is the response to the crisis. We had another interesting question to see how bishops and priests see their relationship with each other, right? And so we gave priests and bishops a number of images, and we asked bishops, when you relate to your priest, which of these images are you living out? Like, how do you see yourself in relation to your priest? Do you see yourself as a brother, as a father, as a co-worker, a servant, etc.? We asked priests, when you see your bishop, how do you see your bishop? Do you see your bishop as a brother, a father, co-worker, etc.? Huge difference between priests and bishops. 73% of bishops see themselves as a brother, compared to 28% of priests who see their bishop as a brother. 70% of bishops see themselves as a father in relation to their priests, compared to only 28% of priests. And then 73% of bishops see themselves as a co-worker, and only 32% of priests see themselves that way, right? So you can see so on and so forth. And where it flips in the other direction is administrator. There's more priests who see their bishop as an administrator, right? So again, the narrative is a little bit off there. That there's quite a bit of difference, and we'll see that what priests want from their bishops often is, I want you to treat me like a father. I want you to treat me like a brother, not like a boss, not like a CEO, right? That keeps coming up. There are also differing perceptions of how much bishops would help their priests with personal struggles. So we asked bishops, how well would you help your priests with their personal struggles if they came to you with those struggles and asked for help? And we asked priests, how well would your bishop help you with your personal struggles if you went to them? 92% of bishops said, I would help my priests very well. 36% of diocesan priests think that their bishop would help them very well. Right? So all of these are confirming anecdotes that priests and bishops have heard, but now with some hard numbers. And then there are also some qualitative data that supports that. So one diocesan priest tells us there's a morale problem in our archdiocese right now for priests. I don't think they feel there's a shepherd right now. I personally have no confidence in my bishop. I would no more call him about something than a stranger on the street. I have no trust in him whatsoever, and I'm not alone. I'd be willing to bet the bishop doesn't know much about us priests at all. Another diocesan priest said, we've been saying for a decade now that the bishops see their priests as liabilities, and we know it, we feel it, And that comes up again, that sense of they'll throw me under the bus. And it's not just the bishop, it's the diocesan machinery, it's the lawyers, there was a way in which they see a whole bureaucratic infrastructure there that they're up against. Finally, bishops rank lowest among priests social sources of support. Right? So we asked them, which of these sources of support do you find in your ministry, and which of these are strong or at least somewhat strong? And they ranked lay friends and family the highest, and their bishops the lowest. You could say 60% is not terrible, but could be better, right? And what's happening is a lot of priests really feel afraid of being accused falsely of sexual abuse, and that they won't be supported. And that's really behind a lot of this. 82% of priests, no difference between diocesan and religious, 82% of priests live regularly in a fear of being falsely accused of sexual abuse. As one diocesan priest puts it, living in constant fear of a life-ending accusation definitely puts a cloud over the priesthood. And honestly, I think most priests have that. Because the life-ending accusation doesn't have to be based in any reality. It can just come out of somebody's 3 years of recovered memory, therapy, have no ground in anything that ever really happened, but you're still doomed when it happened. And everyone knows that. And so there's a lot of hearsay, a lot of stories that circulate that I know a priest to whom this happened and he was finished. There's no hope once this happens to you. Right? And that aggravates, that amplifies the sense of fear that priests seem to feel. And we can see it also corroborated in their expectations in case of false accusations of abuse. And so here, again, there's a big difference between diocesan and religious priests. Would you be provided with sufficient resources by your diocese or local religious community to defend yourself if there was a false accusation of abuse? 36% of diocesan priests think so. 85% of religious priests think that they would be supported. Do you think your bishop or major superior would support you if you were falsely accused? Only 51% of diocesan priests think their bishop would have their backs. 86% of religious think their major superior would support them. Slightly higher levels on whether the legal process would prove their innocence and whether their brother priests would support them, but still significant differences between religious and diocesan priests on those counts. And in our interviews, we hear overall that diocesan priests consistently fear being abandoned. One priest told us, you're persona non grata when something comes to light in terms of an accusation. I do believe that it should be innocent until proven guilty. Lawyers will tell you this. If you have to go see your bishop about something serious, you come in with a lawyer. All of a sudden it's adversarial. You're in your corner, they're in their corner. I think that's what the Charter unleashed. You're guilty until proven innocent in the church now. Another diocesan priest told us, among the priests there's this general sense first that the bishops don't have our backs. There's a sense, I think, generally among priests, that bishops are against a priest who's been accused rather than doing what the bishop must do, but still supporting the priest. What do they want? They want some sense of, yes, we understand what you're dealing with in the trenches, and we're going to support you, and we're not an adversary in this process. The other thing that I think is essential, this priest told us, is an openness and transparency about the process. We as priests have no idea what that process is inside the review board. So there's a lot of mistrust about that. We don't know what standard we're going to be judged by. So there's a lack of transparency, a lack of communication, a lack of clarity that drives this fear. Consider religious priests, on the other hand. No fear of being abandoned. Over and over again, they say, well, you can't throw these people out on the street if they're accused. They're still part of your religious order. They can't function as a priest, but you still have to clothe them and house them. You have to feed them. So there's all limitations placed on what they can do, where they live, who they interact with, their ability to drive a car or their permission to travel, all that. It's all restricted. They're in a very tight leash, but we take care of them in a religious community. Another priest told us, I don't know any priest, to be honest with you, that think we're being treated with any kind of fairness or justice, but thank God, if I were accused of some misconduct, I could stay in the community, I would be taken care of. Well, if you're a diocesan priest, it's like, here's your hat, have a nice life, don't call us, we'll call you. right? And so they're aware that there is this discrepancy between diocesan and religious priests. And again, that's a consistent theme across our interviews. And finally, let's talk about policy and the response to the church's policies and procedures that were put into place in 2002. And particularly the zero tolerance policy. So removal from ministry and potentially laicization of any priest that was against whom there was a credible accusation of child sexual abuse. There is overall quite a bit of support. So 67% of priests think that the zero tolerance policy positively demonstrates the church's values, like protecting the weak. 66% think the zero tolerance policy is helpful to regain the church's trust with the wider public. But 40% think that this policy is harsher than it needs to be. And when we probe further in the interviews, well, what do you mean? In what sense, what are you supportive of and what are you not supportive of? We consistently hear this one kind of story. I get zero tolerance for priests abusing children, as one diocesan priest told us. But now we've got zero tolerance for priests doing anything wrong at this point. Another diocesan priest told us this concept of vulnerable adults, which was introduced very recently as sort of expanding the scope of protections against abuse. This concept of vulnerable adults is so very broad just to be almost undefined. So, anybody who's just intimidated by the fact that you're clergy can pass himself or herself off as a vulnerable adult. Then again, you're doomed because there's no due process, because no one's got your back. Another religious priest similarly told us hard and fast rule of zero tolerance. You can go from outright sexual actions or rape to sexual words but no actions to improper boundary violations. Somewhere you're going to have to draw a line. But just saying any priest with any whiff of anything is gone, that just isn't just, right? And so it's overall the sense that, zero tolerance is absolutely necessary for abusing a minor. But for the case of a consensual relationship with an adult, other kinds of boundary violations, there have to be other kinds of punishments, and we need to understand what the process is, and are we going to be treated the same for all of these cases? Is that what zero tolerance means? And there's no clarity around that, and that's what a lot of priests are asking for. When we look at the impact of policies, most priests are very confident that their diocese has a strong culture of child safety and protection, which is great. However, they also think, 63% think, that the church compliance with the call for transparency has gone too far. So publicizing someone's name when they've been accused, whether or not that accusation is credible or not, right? So again, these things vary a lot by diocese. There's no uniform application of these policies. They're very concerned about that. They also think, the majority of them, that anti-abuse policies don't address the main causes of the abuse problem. And a number of them think that in my diocese, legal or financial concerns take precedence over the well-being of bishops. The idea that the bishop is just a CEO guarding the coffers of the diocese, governed by lawyers and bureaucrats, and they don't really care about us. That sort of narrative comes up very often. We also, again, look at the responses of priests and bishops to the crisis. And again, as I mentioned before, there's overwhelming support both among priests and bishops that bishops should have been subject to the same anti-abuse protocols as priests were. We see some difference, though, that there are more priests who think that there's still wide-scale corruption in the church. There are more bishops than priests who think that there's still unrevealed abuse cases in the church. Very few of them think that the abuse crisis in the church is basically over. Right? So what does all this mean? How do we move forward? How do we move towards rebuilding trust between priests and bishops? We ask priests what they think, what sorts of strategies they would have, what counsel they would have. And three main points come up. The first is, many of them don't really feel supported by their bishop. They feel depersonalized by bureaucracy. They feel expendable. They feel afraid of being abandoned. Priests want their bishops to be fathers. They want their bishops to be brothers. They want their bishops to be co-workers, not CEOs, not bosses. So treat us like a father, have humility, speak to us often, hang out with us, spend time with us. Those appeals came up over and over again. We have a survey question that we're still coding, 3,000 plus responses to an open-ended question on what do you think would help your relationship with the bishop. And this one kept coming over and over again. Treat us like sons, be fathers to us. Second, most priests are living, as we see, in the fear of a false accusation. They're uncertain about what happens to them in case of an abuse allegation. They want more transparency about the process. They want clearer communication. They want assurance of due process. They want to be treated innocent until proven guilty, not to be assumed, not to be treated like criminals. Many priests think that the diocesan chancery treats them like criminals in the first place. So they want that to change. They want more communication. They want to understand the process better. They also want more communication between the bishop and victims and survivors of abuse, which they think hasn't happened. And finally, priests emphasize the need for bishops to be held accountable, properly accountable for past mistakes and also accountable in the future. They feel we can't offer fraternal correction to our bishops. Something needs to be done there. They need to be able to keep each other accountable. Some other mechanisms are needed, and this is really crucial for improving trust in their opinion. So with all that, I want to thank you for your time and attention. We're happy to take questions.
Thank you. My name is Melissa. I'm a lay student in the MDiv for Pastoral Studies. And I have a question about statistics. You had said that you sent the survey of priests to, 10,000? You got about a 37% response rate. I was just curious if that affected the results in any way.
Sure, yeah, that's a really good question. So it's a question about survey response and non-response. So in general, with nationally representative studies, it is very hard these days because everyone hates taking surveys. And as a sociologist, I myself don't like taking them. So it's very tough to get a good response rate. And we thought a 40% would be a pretty good, that was our target. And so we got very close to that at the 36%. We don't see any indication of non-response bias along the indicators that we're aware of. So we sampled priests by their census region and by the size of their diocese. So those are the two main things we sampled. We think there may be a slightly higher response among religious order priests, but that's the only noticeable difference that we see. And even that is not even statistically significant. So we don't think there's any survey non-response. We contacted them multiple times. We had endorsements from very different people, from the president of Catholic University and two cardinals. And so, and the survey was done by Gallup, which is a fairly trusted firm. So we didn't think there's any bias built into that process. But that being said, it's hard to know, without a very, very high response rate, what the non-response bias could potentially be.
Yeah, Brandon, Stephen, very nice piece of work. I'm Peter Kilpatrick, the president of Catholic University. A question about the distribution of trust in bishops from diocese to diocese. You mentioned, and I think I saw some of the detailed data, that it's widely varying. So in some dioceses, bishops have a very high level of trust, priests have a very high level of trust in their bishops, and in some, there's no trust at all. And I'm wondering, in the detailed interviews, if you uncovered specific behaviors or attitudes that really contributed to super high levels of trust of priests and their bishops.
Yeah, I'll take the first part of that. You're right, there was, and Brandon mentioned this, there was significant variation between dioceses reporting low levels of confidence and those reporting high level. The median was still around 50% confidence, which isn't terribly high. As for what the qualitative interviews showed up as to, what policies or cultural elements within a diocese might contribute to higher levels of confidence, I'm going to let Brandon handle that.
Sure, yeah. No, it's a great question. I think it's something that we want to study more is, for those who are doing well, what is driving that, right? And so we've heard, again, a couple of things. There's one that I don't really like, which is the alignment of political and theological views, right? So that's one factor statistically that matters. And we hear that in the interviews as well. Oh yeah, he's a good guy. We're on the same page. There's that sort of thing. What we see in terms of steps they're taking are bishops who are more accessible to their priests. Bishops, we know the bishop likes to spend time with us is really a huge factor. I mean, the fact that you're known as a person, I have a cell phone number. If I wanted to call him, I could call him up. You probably won't as a priest, but the fact that you could is really helpful, right? So there are little steps. When a bishop has made any kind of gesture of vulnerability, admitted to faults, that is seen as a huge indicator. And again, some of this is well known in the leadership literature, but we're seeing it exemplified certainly by bishops who are living that out. So bishops would go golfing with priests and have an open invitation. On this day I'm going, anyone can join me. There's some bishops who travel from parish to parish and just pop in on their priests just to see how they're doing. No agenda, just open, let's hang out, let's have lunch. So the priests are really moved by that. And so those things that, really contribute. It's the human contact that seems to really drive it.
So just a follow-up question. So would it make sense to do a leadership training workshop or a leadership course for bishops? You want your priest to trust you. You want your priest to love you as a father. You want your priest to admire you. You know, here's 40 things you can be doing. We'll teach you how to do them.
The short answer is yes. I know that there are groups that do that kind of work. It would be interesting if Catholic University could do more of that kind of work. To underscore something that Brandon said, and to maybe put a succinct summation of something that I think is important, is that in a lot of these responses, including responses indicating low confidence in bishops, it was much less a matter of personal animosity than it was a sense of impersonal indifference. So it's not that priests personally disliked their bishop, but they just felt that that their treatment was bureaucratic and impersonal, which is still a problem, but is a different kind of problem, and it's one that would seem to be more susceptible to being overcome with proper preparation and formation.
And if I could add to that, just on the other side, one of the things that priests really don't like is when they see their bishops surrounded by a coterie of yes men. Again, not unique to bishops, happens in corporations as well, when there's a sort of a little clique that surrounds the leader, and then you can't penetrate that because you're an outsider. That becomes a real obstacle to trust. But I think we definitely we have, in the qualitative interviews for sure, data that can help us illuminate what contributes to trust, and we can certainly share that and help bishops to be better leaders. It'd be great for us to do that at the university.
Question from online. I'm curious whether the survey data collected on religious priests showed any significant differences between religious orders.
And so the question was, so I don't have to repeat it, right? You were using the mic.
Yeah, do repeat it.
Oh, so the question was whether there were, in the survey data, any differences between religious orders. Unfortunately, we have not analyzed that, so we'll be working on that, and do contact us, whoever you are, and we'll try to get you some data.
I'm looking at Father Aquinas and asking him, are you the one who asked that?
I'm Seth Smith from the History Department. I was caught by the slide that mentioned that priests rely on fellow priests at a relatively low amount for social support. Was that surprising to you, and is there data that supports this or explains why they so rarely seem to turn to their fellow priests?
I'll take a stab at that. And that did jump out to me. In fact, if the slide showed, this was a slide that showed very social support, where priests find social support, and it was highest among lay friends, and the lowest score went to bishops. It was about 60%. I would have expected other priests to be higher on that. It wasn't particularly low. It was in the 80s, if I recall. But the more I thought about that, the more this makes sense. I mean, if the question is about social support, then the people you see the most frequently would hopefully be the ones you find the most support from. And that would be lay friends and parishioners, which were the two things, and family, which is sort of its own thing. But lay friends and parishioners were the groups that scored the highest. And while the bishop's score wasn't particularly high, at 60% of priests saw their bishop as a source of social support, I'm not particularly troubled by that number being the lowest. It would be a little weird to me if, for example, if my pastors drew most of his social support from his bishop, right? We're in a diocese. If every time he needs someone to hang out with, he's got to pick up the phone and call his bishop, there's probably something else going on, or something not right. He's not getting along with his parishioners. He doesn't have any. So I think my reaction to those numbers was I was a little surprised at first that the priest score wasn't higher. But I actually found it reassuring that number was high, but that priests were finding most support from lay friends. I think I may be extrapolating a little bit beyond the data here. I see that as a hopeful sign that our clergy is drawing support from the lay members of their parish, from their lay friends. I think that's a healthy sign for the Church in the United States. I think most priests have an understanding of the degree to which they are dependent on and need their lay friends and their parishioners, and a high score on social support from lay friends and from parishioners would seem to be a likely indicator of healthy relationships between priests and laity.
The only thing I'd add to that, we do have some accounts. We asked them about loneliness and where they find companionship, and asked them whether they spend time with other priests. And a lot of them say, yeah, sometimes I go hang out with my, seminary cohort. But there's not a lot of occasions. They say essentially they're looking for structured occasions. It's not something they want to take the initiative. And even in that case, a lot of them are saying, well, we don't want to talk shop. So what do? We play cards. We do something. It feels like you don't want to do it too often. It's not really contributing to your flourishing, at least in your perception, right? So that's the kind of narrative we're hearing.
Other questions?
I wanted to raise the similar question because that slide jumped out at me too, and I think you're right that it's encouraging that the level of support that priests find in lay friends and family is so high. It's not surprising that it's a little high that they find a lot of social or fraternal support in their bishops. It's 60. I think it was about 75% that find that kind of support in other priests. I think I'd like to know more about it because that suggests that 1 in 4 priests don't have a significant friendship or a source of support in another priest. I think that's, to my mind, that's high. That 1 in 4 wouldn't have that, or at least that's, unless I'm reading that stat wrong. And it's not to oppose, those sources of support among priests, sources of support among laity. Just seems to me that you'd want both of those numbers to be around the 90% level. So it did strike me that the source of support in brother priests was that low.
Yeah, we'd have to analyze that. I mean, it's a good question as to why there's the extent of social support or lack of social support among priests. It'd be good for us to analyze that and see how that particular item is skewed. For instance, are there a lot of priests who are like, yeah, I find somewhat supported, or are there a lot who say none at all, right? So we don't quite know. We haven't looked at it in depth, so we'll definitely have to probe that further.
It also seems to me that this is related to a couple other factors. We talked about increased burnout indicators among younger priests, especially, and things like that. You can imagine in a diocese that has a lot of vocations that you'll have 3 or 4 priests in a rectorate that have a built-in local sort of communal source. They don't even have to leave the parish to go see another priest or hang out with others. I know a priest in the Midwest who, upon ordination, was made pastor of 6 parishes. That's a different scenario. So the question then becomes, why is there increased burnout, especially among younger priests? One of the things that occurs to us, we haven't found a way to demonstrate it, to prove it with the numbers, but seems it obviously suggests itself, is the question of isolation, especially among younger priests. If you have fewer priests per parish, you're going to have less opportunities that present themselves for that kind of fraternal support. We've also seen, and this is more anecdotal, an increased interest among diocesan priests who are younger for finding ways to increase opportunities for fraternal engagement. Less interest in that among older diocesan priests. They seem to be, I don't want to say set in their ways, but they're comfortable with how things are, and they've managed to arrange their lives in that way of life, and they're okay with that. But among younger priests, you're beginning to see different ways of trying to, whether that's just scheduling outings as a group of young priests to go hike a mountain or something, even from that to diocesan priests, secular priests looking for ways to where they can make arrangements so they can actually live in community. They remain diocesan priests, they remain secular priests. They're not in a religious community, but they find a way so that they, for all kinds of reasons, for social reasons, to combat isolation, to have accountability, all kinds of things, looking for ways to live in community. So that's an interesting area for more exploration.
Hello, I'm Molly Farrell with the USCCD, Secretariat of Child and Youth Protection. First, I want to thank you for this research. There's so much information in here, and I'm looking forward to digging deep into a lot of it. But my question for today is in regards to how priests feel the support of the bishop or lack thereof when there is an allegation. They overwhelmingly support the idea of zero tolerance, yet when there's an allegation, and by and large, they are often removed immediately from ministry, they're not feeling supported. Did they indicate any way that, or what would need to happen in order for them to feel supported? What kind of strategies or actions would a bishop need to take to demonstrate support for that priest while he's simultaneously removed from ministry?
This is a really important question. The question is, what did the priests indicate any ways that they would, anything that bishops could do to make priests feel more supported in case of an allegation so that they're not feeling that they're abandoned? This is a question that interests a lot of bishops, I know, in particular. It interests a lot of priests. Bishops want to be able to help their priests. Most of the bishops that I've talked with understand that their priests are in this tough position, and they don't like that. The way the charter is set up, the threshold for being pulled from ministry is very, very low. And oftentimes when a priest is pulled from ministry, it's for an allegation that can't be clearly proven or disproven. So a priest is often in a tough spot until a determination can be made. There are dioceses where dozens of priests have been we've had look-back windows opening in different states around the country, removing temporarily statutes of limitations. So you've had priests that are pulled from ministry on a single anonymous allegation that the diocese can't even investigate because the name of the accuser isn't public. So the diocese can't even go and interview that person to find out if there's anything to this allegation. So those priests are pulled from ministry, and eventually they have to be reinstated. Now, hopefully that's an innocent priest who's being reinstated and that's something good. But everyone knows why he was pulled from ministry, so that sticks with his reputation. That's a problem. On the other hand, the diocese in some of these cases hasn't been able to really determine anything about the allegation. So maybe there is merit to that allegation, but the diocese can't know. In that case, they're putting a priest back into ministry who shouldn't be put back into ministry, and the diocese has to make that decision. The bishop ultimately has to make that decision. That's a tough position for bishops to be in, not just priests. This is a long way of saying a clear and sort of uniform protections around due process. I know the bishops are currently working on a revision of the charter, as they do every several years. Finding some way to sort of make more robust and clear and uniform due process protections around the initial stage when there's an allegation made, I think that would do a lot to help priests be more confident in the process. And frankly, I think that would help a lot of bishops who would have who would be able to rely on a clear and more uniform process rather than to make judgment calls that affect the lives of someone who's brought an allegation, the lives of a priest who's been accused, the lives of everyone in the parish, and they don't necessarily have the enough support built into the system to make that judgment well every time. So I think more due process protections, more uniform due process protections would help everybody, including bishops, on that score.
I absolutely agree. And just to add to that, a lot of the fear and lack of being supported is it's driven by the sense of uncertainty. I don't really know what happens. Like, this is just a black box, and there's so much inconsistency across dioceses. There's a lot of hearsay around. As I mentioned, it's a lot of the fear is stoked by, well, it happened to this guy. He was accused anonymously, and then he couldn't go back to the rectory to get his underwear. Like, what is this, right? So once that happens, that completely erodes any trust you might have in the bishop. And the last thing is just the request, that the plea for humanization. Treat me like a human being. Don't just send me a letter. I don't want just an anonymous call from some official in the bureaucracy telling me I'm pulled from ministry, right? So that, where's the human contact in this? Can I know that our lawyers will actually try to protect me and not just guard our finances and prioritize that over my life as a priest, right? So knowing those kinds of things, having those assurances that, yeah, someone's got my back and I'll be treated like a human being and someone's going to support me, I think goes a long way.
One last point on this question. You can call it realism or call it cynicism, and I think Brandon and I would sometimes differ on which word we use. I'm more of a realist. He says it's more cynicism. But there is this interesting thing where priests are very supportive of the policies of the Dallas Charter. And they're at the same time worried about a false allegation. So they carry this sort of weight around, and yet they report very high levels of fulfillment and well-being in their ministry. is that cognitive dissonance, or is that priests being realistic about the burden that they carry, that they're worried about an allegation, that they don't feel necessarily like they'd be supported in the case of one, but they also understand that that's a burden they carry because of other people's sins, and that they're still eager and willing to engage in their ministry as best they can. I see that actually as a hopeful sign, as priests being realistic about a very difficult situation that they're not satisfied with, but which they're willing to keep up their ministry even in those circumstances, because that's what they love to do and that's what they're called to do. Not to put words in your mouth, but a more cynical view is that, you know, either they're not telling the truth about how satisfied they are, or you know, that they've just become cynical about the bureaucracy in the diocese or whatever, and they just sort of deal with these. There's a sort of a mental break there, and they deal with these two things differently. So the fact that priests are fulfilled even while they have these real legitimate concerns, I think is actually a healthy sign. I don't think that I'm looking at this through rose-colored glasses when I say that. I think that's a sign that our priests see this as a real challenge, as a burden, but they're also realistic. And priests know that there are people who suffer much more than they do, who are the causes of that suffering is the reason that these policies are in place to begin with. So that they're that's realism, I think.
Yeah, my only concern I'd add to that is there is a palpable sense of cynicism around the bureaucracy in the diocese and how we're just going to be thrown under the bus. And I don't think it's a healthy sign in any organization to have that kind of, rolling your eyes when you're talking about the leadership and then the structure of the entity, right? So even if you are able to thrive, I don't know in the long term whether that's going to last, because I think this can erode your sense of well-being over time. And we see among the younger priests, that's where the higher levels of burnout and cynicism and so forth tend to be. So will that, be an obstacle for them to continue in ministry? We don't know. But I as a scholar of organizations, get a bit concerned when I see those sorts of things.
A quick question about Stephen Cranny. Quick question about the questions that kind of showed some daylight between the bishops and the other priests. So presumably the bishops come from a different cohort as well. So I was kind of wondering if you sort of controlled for age to see if this was really just an age effect with the bishops kind of agreeing, say, with the other priests that are kind of their own age, or if this really is a bishop-priest effect going on.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it was around whether there's in the statistics showing differences between bishops and priests reports whether there might be an age effect. So these are just the bivariate. So we don't have any controls on these. So we'd have to look and see whether there's I suspect there will be some age variation for sure. We don't know how much.
Will each bishop receive the results for their specific diocese?
Question is, will each bishop receive the specific results for their diocese? The answer to that is no. Brandon, you can elaborate on why that is.
Yeah, sure. So we have a research review board that for our project. This was done by Gallup, and so their internal review board determined that it would be a violation of confidentiality to release any information about which dioceses participated in the study, which priests from those dioceses participated. So we really can't disclose any of those results. And that was made clear to priests, in fact, when we invited them to take the study. It was clear to them in the invitation that no one will know that your diocese was, a participant in the study. And so there's no way to trace them back, essentially. That confidentiality is really important to maintain.
We can say, though, how many dioceses participate, and the number is
193?
193 dioceses and eparchies, so it was a lot.
Last question from online. What are the next steps with regard to these results? How will the information be used going forward to improve specific areas and the culture as a whole?
The first answer to that is, every Catholic I've ever spoken to wants our priests to be good priests and to be supported. Understanding where we're doing a good job of that and where we're doing not so good of a job of that is important just in itself. Some of the bishops I've talked to about this data have been concerned. There's some things in here that don't reflect terribly well on the bishops as a whole. Most of them have been pretty sober-minded about that, realistic about that. Many of them were not surprised when they saw some of this data. I think the idea is to try and find ways to help our priests, because all of us as Catholics depend on them in our parishes and for our spiritual well-being. So understanding better the challenges they face and having some better sense of how we can help them face those challenges is important. I think one of the great casualties of this sort of horrible abuse crisis that we've been through is precisely an erosion of trust. We talked a lot today about how that seems to be in evidence between priests and bishops, but I think it's clear that that's not the only relationship that's been damaged by the kinds of sins and crimes that were committed in the church. So finding ways to heal trust begins with taking a sober look at where that trust is lacking and why it might be lacking. So while the news in our study seems to be mixed, I think like if we did a study of the priests of the United States and came out and said, look, everything's hunky-dory, I don't think anyone would take us seriously. So I think it's important to see the good and the bad so that we can make better decisions about how we go forward from here.
In terms of practical steps, I mean, we do, there's the scholars here. We're working on, conference papers and journal articles and so on, so the scholarly community can sort of better review the work we're doing, and we welcome collaborators in this process. So if anyone's listening and wants to join us here, please do let us know to help us sort of better. I mean, we have a lot of data, a lot of very rich data, and this will be really helpful, I think, for years to come. Practical steps are also being taken by a number of initiatives, institutes, entities around the country. So there's certainly a group at the Spitzer Institute. There's Senior Schlag at the University of St. Thomas. We've got our own business school that's trying to create initiatives. So there's a lot of initiatives where our data, I think, could be really helpful in driving change. And so we have what is right now potentially a benchmark or kind of a sort of baseline figure that would potentially provide us with some useful information for a future study to be able to see, can we move the needle on some of these trust indicators? So that's another thing to keep in mind, where for those who are thinking about interventions, we'd like to be able to see and track and measure some of this change, potentially to see improvements in the future.
I don't see any other questions from the audience. I think we've covered everything from online. So thank you again for coming. Once again, you can find the report on our website, catholicproject.catholic.edu. Thank you all, and God bless.